She was betrayed, left to die in a forest by the woman meant to protect her, but she didn't vanish. She survived, and deep within the woods, a story began. Not of a princess waiting to be saved, but of a soul rising through darkness to become the light of a kingdom. Until one day, the magic mirror spoke, "Snow White is the fairest of them all." That single sentence unleashed a storm, a poisoned comb, a cursed apple, a ring wrapped in death, and then a kiss. Not from a savior, but from someone who truly saw her. Long ago, when the world still shimmered with forgotten magic, and the wind carried stories between the trees, there stood a castle wrapped in winter's hush. Snow blanketed the hills and frosted every leaf, turning the kingdom into a delicate dream of white and silver. Inside the castle, a queen sat quietly by her window, her breath misting against the glass as she watched flakes dance in the sky. She was graceful, beloved by her people, and adored by her husband, the king. Yet her heart held an ache that no crown could soothe. She longed for a child, a daughter, born not of power or lineage, but of hope. That longing settled deep within her bones, soft as a sigh. One evening, as snowflakes fell like whispers from the sky, the queen took a piece of black thread in hand and pricked her finger while sewing. A single drop of blood landed on the windowsill, bright against the white snow. Her voice, barely more than a breath, carried her wish into the dusk. "I wish for a daughter, with skin as white as snow lips, as red as rose petals, and hair as dark as the night sky, in an age when the veil between worlds was thin." Wishes did not simply drift away. The wind caught hers gently, carrying it into the forest, over the mountains, and through the quiet places where magic still stirred. Somewhere in the stillness, something old and kind heard the longing of a mother's heart. Seasons passed. One spring morning, the castle was filled with the soft cries of a newborn. The queen cradled her daughter beneath the same window where she had made her wish. The baby's skin gleamed pale and lovely, her lips curled like blossoms, and her hair shone black as raven's feathers. The queen smiled through joyful tears. "We shall name her Snow White," she whispered. The entire kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang from distant towers, flowers spilled into the streets, and the skies opened in a gentle rain, as if the heavens themselves were blessing the child. For a time, all was peaceful, but joy, like snow, is fragile. Not long after Snow White was born, a hush fell over the palace. The queen weakened from childbirth, and illness began to fade like mist in the morning light. Though physicians tried every remedy known to man and magic, her breaths grew slower, her voice softer. One final winter morning, as the snow returned to kiss the earth, the queen pressed her lips to Snow White's tiny brow and closed her eyes forever. The king was inconsolable. He wandered the halls like a ghost, his crown heavier than ever before. But even grief could not keep the world from turning, and time, as always, moved forward. Snow White grew a quiet wonder to all who saw her. She inherited her mother's gentle nature, but also something wilder, an instinct to listen to the wind and speak to the trees. She was kind not only to nobles, but to kitchen maids and stable boys. Her laughter rang like wind chimes through the gardens, and even the grumpiest of guards found themselves smiling when she passed. The castle, though, dulled by sorrow, still pulsed with her light. As Snow White blossomed, so too did the king's need for companionship. He was still young, handsome, and adored. Though many noble women sought his favor, it was the widow of a fallen courtier who finally won his heart. She was striking, with golden hair that gleamed like sunlight and eyes that never truly smiled. People whispered that her beauty was the kind that grew colder the longer you looked. Still, she carried herself with grace, spoke with measured kindness, and soon she wore the crown of queen. To the court, it was a story of healing, a kingdom moving forward. But the wind that once carried a mother's wish now stirred uneasily around the palace. The servants spoke in hushed tones. Shadows seemed to linger longer in the corners of the halls. And when Snow White passed the new queen in the corridors, the air grew still. At first, the queen was attentive. She offered compliments, held Snow White's hand, even braided her hair before the king. But something colder lurked beneath the surface. Snow White, wise beyond her years, felt it. It was in the way the queen's eyes followed her, not with warmth, but calculation. The king, blinded by his longing to forget pain, did not see, and so the quiet turned into silence, the glances into glares, and the whispers into plans. Deep in the queen's chambers stood a mirror unlike any other. It was old, older than the kingdom itself, and bound to her through ancient rites. When she stood before it, the air thickened, and when she spoke, the words, looking glass on the wall. Who is the fairest of them all? There came a voice, ancient and knowing, from within. You, O queen, are fairest of them all. But that would not always be the answer. Not as Snow White continued to grow. Not as her beauty and kindness began to eclipse even the sunlit grace of the queen. And far from the mirror, far from schemes and shadows, Snow White, unaware of what would come, stood once more at the very same window where her mother had made her wish. Snowflakes danced around her like secrets in the wind, and the story truly had only just begun. From the moment the new queen stepped into the castle, something shifted, not in ways easily seen, but in the subtle language of silence. Shadows lengthened slightly. The hallway winds turned cooler. The walls, once whispering stories of warmth, now murmured uncertainty. She was beautiful, undeniably so. Her golden hair gleamed like woven sunlight. Her skin was smooth as porcelain, and her eyes shimmered like still lakes. She came with a sweet smile and soft words, yet the servants could not shake the feeling that her smile was a mask, polished, perfect, but hollow. To the king, she was a balm. After so much loss, he craved companionship, someone to hold someone, to stand beside him. He saw only what he needed: grace, elegance, quiet affection. He did not see what others felt, that every time she entered a room, laughter would falter, warmth would retreat, and even the candles seemed to dim. Snow White, still young and innocent, noticed. The queen no longer braided her hair or complimented her in passing. Instead, her eyes grew sharp, her words colder, and her presence heavier. What began as subtle corrections became sharp rebukes, then disdain, and finally neglect. The king. He was buried in affairs of state, in the building of roads and treaties. He did not see the daughter who no longer sang at the window. He missed the way her hands grew rough with chores, once beneath a princess. He did not notice her silence in the great hall, her bowed head, her tired eyes. But Snow White did not complain. In her heart, her mother's memory burned like a quiet candle. On her loneliest days, she wandered to the back garden where her mother once planted an apple tree. There, under its bare winter branches, she closed her eyes and remembered soft lullabies, the brush of warm lips on her forehead, and a love deeper than the roots of the earth. Meanwhile, the queen had a secret. In the depths of night, after the castle had quieted and the torches dimmed, she retreated to her private chamber, where an ancient mirror hung. This was no ordinary glass. It pulsed with old power, bound to her by rites no priest dared speak of. She stood before it, her hair unbound, her reflection glowing pale and sharp, looking glass on the wall. Who is the fairest of them all? Smoke curled within the mirror, and a voice rose, aged, rasping, certain. You, O queen, are fairest of them all. Each time the mirror affirmed her beauty, the queen smiled with twisted satisfaction. But deep within her, something darker stirred. Snow White was growing glowing. Each day, her innocence and kindness bloomed brighter, and the queen began to feel something dreadful: envy. Snow White had no idea about the mirror, the midnight rituals, or the dark obsession taking root. She still helped in the kitchens, swept the courtyards, and laughed quietly with the stable hands. She still believed the castle was her home, but it was changing. And so was her place in it. On her 16th birthday, the king insisted on a small courtly dinner to honor her. The queen begrudgingly ordered a new gown, choosing a dull gray fabric, meant to make the girl look plain. But when Snow White entered the great hall, every head turned. Even in muted tones, she shimmered. Her skin glowed like snow under moonlight. Her hair rippled like ink on silk, and her eyes sparkled like stars lost in daylight. She did not wear power, she simply was. The queen sat beside the king, her hands clenched around the arms of her throne, her lips pressed thin. Her heart thudded with a heat that was not admiration, but fury. That night, when the guests had gone and the king lay in peaceful sleep, the queen returned to her mirror, looking glass on the wall. Who is the fairest of them all? This time the mirror swirled deeper, slower, almost reluctant. Then came the voice, soft yet cold as stone. My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White. The words struck like a blade. She stood motionless for a breath, then another. Inside her chest, something cracked, no louder than the sound of frost breaking underfoot, but it echoed through every shadow in her soul. She turned from the glass, and her eyes narrowed. Snow White would have to go. No one would ever shine brighter than the queen. And so began the slow, silent descent into darkness. The mirror had spoken. The seed had been planted, and the storm was coming. The morning came with wind scratching at the windows and clouds crowding the sky. Snow White rose early, as she always did, unaware that this day would become the line that divided everything before and after. The queen, cloaked in icy calm, had made her decision. The mirror had dared to speak what she feared, and now she would silence that truth. Not with magic, no, not yet, but with something quieter, colder, a disappearance without trace. While the king was away on a distant diplomatic mission, the queen summoned one of the kitchen maids. A plain, forgettable girl with a dull look in her eyes, easily swayed, especially under a spell. The queen's voice, like velvet soaked in venom, wove a simple enchantment. Obedience, without question, and memory that would fade the moment the deed was done. She instructed the maid to take Snow White into the forest under the pretense of collecting herbs, rare ones found only deep among the birch and thorn. That morning, the queen appeared almost affectionate. she found Snow White warming her hands by the hearth and approached with a smile stretched too tightly. "You've spent too much time in these cold walls," the queen said sweetly. "The herbs for your bath salts are running low. Would you like to go out into the woods to gather more?" Snow White blinked, surprised, but honored by the sudden attention. She'd always loved the forest, its silence, its hidden life, its stories. Only trees seemed to understand. So she nodded, wrapped herself in a wool cloak, and joined the maid who waited by the stables. They rode together on a single horse, with a basket slung between them, and the wind already biting at their cheeks. As they left the castle gates behind, Snow White didn't notice the way the queen watched from her high tower window, her gaze following them, like a hawk tracing prey. The forest welcomed them with rustling leaves and the soft crunch of hooves upon frozen moss. Snow White, despite the chill, found peace in the tall trees, the way their branches cradled the sky like outstretched arms. The maid spoke little, only nodding and guiding the horse deeper. "Shouldn't we stop soon?" Snow White asked after a while. "This is farther than I've ever gone." The maid pointed ahead with a blank expression. "Just a little further. There's a ravine where the wild lavender grows." Snow White trusted her. She always had. The servants had been her only friends during the long, quiet years. So when they reached a slope covered in vines and twisted roots, Snow White dismounted without hesitation. She clutched the basket and climbed down slowly, her boots sinking into damp earth. The wind howled around her, tugging at her cloak. Behind her, the maid stayed silent. When Snow White turned back to speak, the horse and the maid were already gone. She froze. Only wind and trees remained. "Hello," she called out, her voice lost in the trees. There was no reply. She spun in place, heart-quickening confusion turning to fear. The forest, once so familiar, now felt vast and unknowable. Her basket slipped from her fingers, landing with a dull thud among the roots. "Is this a joke?" she shouted louder, half laughing, as if someone might spring from behind a tree and declare it a prank. But the wind only grew stronger, carrying no answer. Panic bloomed in her chest. She ran back toward the place she thought they'd come from. But every tree looked the same. Every bend in the path repeated itself like a cruel riddle. Hours passed in a blur of stumbling, shivering, and calling into silence. Eventually, her steps slowed. Her hands had gone numb. Her cheeks were raw. And her hope, so bright that morning, now flickered like a candle in the storm. Just when she was about to collapse among the roots of a dead tree, she spotted something up ahead. A flicker of structure square and still hidden among the thickets. A cabin. Snow White pushed herself toward it, branches slashing her arms, thorns tugging her cloak. she stumbled into a clearing where the little wooden house stood. Its windows dark, its chimney quiet. No one answered her knock, but the cold was crueler than her manners. She pushed open the door. Inside, shadows greeted her. The fireplace had long gone cold, and the room smelled faintly of damp earth and herbs. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a long table, 7 small chairs, and 7 beds neatly arranged, yet lived in. She felt like an intruder. Yet her fingers, stiff with frost, reached for the small wood pile beside the hearth. She built a fire slowly, clumsily, until warmth began to return to her fingertips. Then and only then did she notice the bread, half a loaf, resting on the table. Crumbs scattered like forgotten blessings. Her stomach ached with hunger. She washed a set of utensils, sliced a piece, and ate with slow, grateful bites. Every chew was a memory of the life she thought she'd left forever. When she finished, she sat down, body trembling from exhaustion and warmth alike. Her head ached. Her vision swam, and the beds, so small yet so inviting. She laid herself gently across the covers of one. Just for a moment, she told herself, and in less than a breath, she was asleep. Far behind her, at the highest window of the castle, the queen smiled once more. The forest had swallowed the girl whole. No one would ever find her, or so she thought. Night crept gently over the forest, tucking its dark fingers between the trees and softening every sound. In the heart of that great whispering wood, the little cabin stood still. Its chimney, now breathing smoke, its windows faintly aglow with firelight, and within it, a girl sleeping peacefully on a bed too small for someone her size. Snow White did not stir. The warmth of the fire had melted the ache from her limbs, and her dreams drifted quietly, carrying her far from the fear and cold of the day. Much later, the owners of the cabin returned. 7 dwarves, weary from their long day of work in the distant hills, trudged home with pickaxes slung over their backs and dirt beneath their nails. They laughed and teased one another in low voices, their steps rhythmic and familiar. But as they reached the clearing and saw the soft orange flicker through the windows, their conversation stopped. "Someone's lit our fire," muttered the tallest of the group. "Or a ghost's found comfort in our hearth," whispered another half-serious. They approached the door slowly, with cautious hearts and quiet feet. The first to enter was their leader, wise, reserved, and always the first to sense when something was amiss. What he saw made him stop in the doorway, blinking. There, curled like a fawn, lay Snow White, her hair spread over the blanket, her hands tucked beneath her cheek, her face soft in sleep. One by one, the dwarves crept in behind him. They gathered in silence around the bed, their eyes wide with wonder. Never before had they seen a creature so lovely, so strange, and so clearly human deep in the forest. "She doesn't look dangerous," whispered the youngest, who wore a crooked cap. "No, she looks lost," murmured another. There was a long pause. Finally, the leader nodded. "We'll let her sleep," he said simply. "She's clearly been through something." And so, with quiet understanding, they made room. One dwarf slept by the fire, another curled beneath the table, and the rest found corners, chairs, or hammocks to rest in. The cabin settled once more into silence, the fire popping gently, the wind brushing softly at the eaves. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the small windows. Birds chirped outside as if nothing unusual had occurred. Snow White stirred. She sat up slowly, eyes adjusting to the brightness, and gasped when she saw the small faces watching her from across the room. Some curious, others cautious, all waiting. Her hand flew to her mouth in surprise. "Oh," she breathed. I didn't mean to intrude." The dwarf with the crooked cap stepped forward and tilted his head. "Are you all right, miss?" She nodded, flustered. "I think so. I got lost in the woods. I was left behind. I found this cabin by accident. I only meant to rest for a moment, I promise." The dwarves looked at one another. The oldest among them took a step forward. "You're welcome to stay, child. We've heard nothing of a search or a missing girl. You must have come from far off." Snow White hesitated. Should she tell them who she was? That she was a princess sent to perish in the woods? But something inside her said no, not yet. It was safer to be someone else for now. "I've been living in a castle," she said carefully, "but things changed. I had to leave." The dwarves didn't press her. They were private beings themselves. If she had secrets, they would let her keep them until she was ready to share. "You may stay," said the leader. "We'll help you figure out what comes next. But life here is simple. We work hard and expect everyone to help." Snow White nodded eagerly. "I'd be happy to help. I can sweep, clean light fires, even cook." One dwarf raised an eyebrow skeptically. "I'm not very good at it," she added quickly, cheeks flushing. "But I'll learn," and she did. In the days that followed, Snow White settled into a life very different from the one she had known. She chopped vegetables, stoked the hearth, and fetched water from the well. She swept the floors with a song on her lips and fed the birds that gathered on the windowsill. The dwarves grew fond of her quickly. She was gentle, cheerful, and never complained, despite her clumsy attempts at porridge or her tendency to mix up herbs for tea. In the evenings, they taught her things she had never learned at the castle: how to read the stars, how to mend boots, how to listen to the forest like it was alive. One dwarf, the wisest of them, began giving her lessons in the evenings. He opened old books with thick leather covers and fragile pages. Together, they read poetry and myths, practiced numbers, and traced maps of faraway lands. Snow White flourished. The shadows in her heart began to fade. Though she did not forget the betrayal, she stopped trembling at every creak of the woods. With the dwarves, she felt safe. She felt seen, and for a time it was enough. But miles away, in a room darkened by velvet curtains and the weight of vanity, the queen once again stood before her mirror, looking glass on the wall. She said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Who is the fairest of them all?" The smoke curled thick and black. "My queen," said the voice, slow and unmistakable, "your beauty still shines bright. But the fairest is Snow White." The queen's smile vanished. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale as realization dawned. The girl was alive, and if she was alive, she could return. She could threaten everything, and this time, there would be no mistakes. The wind in the queen's tower howled louder than before, as if the castle itself had heard the mirror's words and dared to whisper the truth. Snow White lived. She had survived the forest, and not only that, she had grown even fairer. The queen's fingers trembled as they gripped the stone ledge of her mirror's stand. Her breath came short. That same ancient voice echoed in her mind over and over. The fairest is Snow White. She could hardly bear to hear it. For years, the mirror had been her secret comfort. Its truth was absolute, a constant chorus of praise that kept her power intact. But now, it had turned. The voice had chosen another, a younger one, a softer one, and worse, it had spoken her name, Snow White. The queen paced her chamber in silence, her gown whispering with every step. No one could know the mirror's prophecy. No one could see the fury burning beneath her poised exterior. She had failed once. It would not happen again. This time, she would go herself. She opened her private cupboard, hidden behind a velvet curtain, and drew forth a small iron-bound chest. From within, she took what looked like an ordinary hair comb carved from dark wood, set with tiny gems that sparkled with unnatural fire. It was enchanted, a spell twisted through its teeth. A slumbering curse, woven in secret language, designed not to kill instantly, but to lull its wearer into a sleep so deep it would slide softly into death. "Let the world think it is natural," she whispered to herself. "Let them find her still and peaceful. No blood, no cries, just a girl who never woke up." Disguising herself as a wandering peddler, she cloaked her golden hair in a scarf, painted her lips pale, and darkened the creases of her face. When she looked in the mirror again, she saw an old woman smiling back. No one would suspect a thing. With the spell secured and her plan perfected, she mounted a horse and vanished into the early morning fog, riding through forests like a shadow moving between trees. Back at the cottage, Snow White was humming softly as she brushed crumbs from the table. She had grown into a rhythm in the dwarves' home, a harmony of warmth, light, and gentle laughter. Though her past still flickered in her dreams, she no longer trembled when the wind rustled the leaves. She had begun to heal. That afternoon, while the dwarves worked deep in the hills, she heard the faint jingle of metal and a voice calling outside, pretty things for pretty girls. Combs and clasps, trinkets for your lovely hair. Snow White stepped toward the window and saw a small, hunched figure standing by the gate, a basket slung over her shoulder filled with glittering treasures. Her heart hesitated, but only for a moment. This woman looked nothing like the maid who had led her astray. And besides, hadn't the stranger bitten into the apple last time? What harm could there be in looking? She opened the door a crack. The old woman grinned, showing crooked teeth. "Ah, a beauty indeed. May I show you something?" Snow White nodded politely. The woman shuffled forward, pulling from her basket a fine wooden comb. It shimmered in the sunlight, the gems embedded along its spine, glinting like dewdrops on spider silk. "This," the peddler whispered, "is magic. Not true magic, of course, but look how it catches the light. It would be perfect in your hair." Snow White smiled shyly. "It's very pretty. Try it on," urged the woman. "A gift from an old lady who loves to see beauty shine." Snow White hesitated, but then remembering her tangle of hair and the kindness of the stranger's voice, she took the comb and slipped it gently into her hair. At once, the spell took hold. A sharp breath caught in her throat. Her knees weakened. The sky above her seemed to dim. Before she could speak, she crumpled soundlessly to the earth, her hand still reaching upward. The queen, still disguised, watched with satisfaction as the girl's chest rose once, and then no more. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her heart full of triumph. This time, she thought the mirror would speak rightly. Hours later, the dwarves returned from their labor, with dirt on their boots and laughter in their throats. But it died instantly when they saw Snow White lying motionless in the garden path. "No!" one of them gasped. They rushed to her side, gently turning her over. Her face was calm, her lips slightly parted, as if she had merely fallen into a nap. But her skin was too pale, too still. "She's cold," whispered one. They searched her hair, her hands, her dress. And then one dwarf spotted the comb. "I've never seen this before," he muttered, and carefully he reached for it. The moment it left, her hair, a shudder passed through her body. Her eyes fluttered. "Snow White," they cried in chorus. She blinked, confused, her lips parting as she gasped for air. I don't remember falling." They crowded around her, with relief tears springing to eyes not used to weeping. The wisest among them placed the comb in a cloth, wrapping it like one would a snake. This was no gift. It was a trap. They helped Snow White inside, gave her water and soup, and this time they sat her down for a very serious talk. "You must promise," said the eldest, "never again take gifts from strangers, no matter how sweet they seem." Snow White nodded solemnly. "I will not forget." But even as she said it, the wind outside stirred uneasily. Far away, the queen stood once again before her mirror, expecting praise, expecting victory. But the voice returned cold and eternal. "My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White." The mirror had spoken, and the queen's fury would darken the world. Rain fell lightly over the forest the next morning. The cottage stood still beneath the clouds, its roof dotted with raindrops like tiny silver coins. Inside, Snow White sat near the hearth, running her fingers through her hair where the comb had once pierced. Though her body had healed, something deeper trembled within her, a shadow she couldn't quite name. The dwarves moved quietly around her. That day, their usual laughter replaced with watchful eyes. They tended the fire with extra care. They double-bolted the door. When they left for work, they reminded her, "Do not open the door. Not for anyone. Not even a whisper in disguise." Snow White nodded. She promised. But far beyond the trees, in the tallest tower of the castle, a woman dressed in velvet and vengeance screamed into a mirror that would no longer lie. Snow White still lived. The queen's fury could no longer be calmed by vanity. Her pride, once polished like a blade, now burned like wildfire through her veins. And so she turned again to her hidden arts. From her apothecary, she retrieved a single apple, round, red, and perfect. She held it to the light. It was already beautiful, but now it would become deadly. The enchantment she cast this time was older than words. It whispered itself into the core of the fruit, dividing it neatly in two. One side safe, one side cursed. To any eye, it would appear flawless. But one bite from the wrong half, and the sleeper would fall into death, so silent, so deep, it would feel like an eternal dream. She tasted the good half first, smiling sweetly, so that even the most careful soul would be fooled. Then once more, she disguised herself this time as an old crone wrapped in rags, her back bent, her basket filled with apples that glowed beneath the gray sky. She walked for hours, the rain dampening her cloak, and the curse clinging to her like smoke. At the cottage, Snow White hung laundry on the line. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Despite all warnings, her heart remained tender. She still wanted to believe the best in strangers. That was her magic, her curse, and her gift. The old woman shuffled into view, singing softly, "Apples, sweet apples, for a girl like you." Snow White looked up, startled. "No, thank you," she said politely. "I can't accept anything. I promised." The crone laughed, a rusty, harmless sound. "Oh, child, I wouldn't dare ask for coin or kindness. But I can share a story and a slice. I've 2 apples here, see?" She held up the apple, then took out a knife and cut it in half with trembling hands. "Look," she said, taking a bite of her half. "No tricks, only sweetness. You try the other side." Snow White hesitated. The apple gleamed in the soft light. It smelled like summer, like the orchard behind the castle where she once ran barefoot as a child. The woman had eaten her piece. How could it be wrong? So with a gentle smile, she lifted the other half to her lips and took a single bite. The world tilted, her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers lost their grip. She stumbled once, then crumpled into the grass, the apple rolling from her hand. The queen didn't linger. She left in silence, fading into the woods as the clouds swallowed the sun. That evening, the dwarves returned early, drawn by a strange unease. The moment they saw the front gate open and the laundry still wet on the line, their hearts dropped. "Snow White," one cried. They found her beneath the apple tree. Her skin pale as moonlight, her lips frozen in a silent question. She lay still, peaceful, but wrong. "No," whispered the eldest, falling to his knees. They searched her body for signs: combs, ribbons, pins. Nothing. Only the apple, nearby its flesh, stained where her teeth had touched. "She didn't know," one dwarf said, his voice breaking. "She trusted again," said another, wiping his eyes. They carried her inside, gently, reverently. They placed her on the softest bed, surrounded her with flowers from the woods, and lit candles that flickered through the night. But this time, nothing changed. She did not wake, not after hours, not after a day, not even after 3. "She's gone," said the wisest dwarf, his voice barely a whisper. "And no magic, we know, can call her back." Yet they could not bear to bury her, so they built her a coffin of crystal and gold and placed it in the clearing behind their home. Birds came to perch on the branches above. Animals curled near her grave like mourners keeping watch. The forest grew quiet, and time like breath began to slow. But fate was not finished. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, a traveler came down the winding path, his horse slow, his eyes scanning the trees. He was a prince. The same young man who had once leaned on the garden gate, charmed by the girl with rose-petal lips and star-lit eyes. He had returned. He dismounted when he saw the clearing. And when he looked upon the crystal casket, he fell to his knees. He did not ask who she was. He already knew. "Snow White," he whispered. "I came back." The dwarves stood behind him, silent and still. "I should have come sooner. I should have taken her with me when I had the chance." He reached into the coffin with shaking hands and gently lifted hers. Then, brushing a single kiss against her cold fingers, he whispered, "Please, don't let this be the end." And in that moment, something changed. Her throat fluttered, her lips parted, and the piece of poisoned apple slipped from her mouth, landing like a teardrop on the crystal glass. The air in the clearing stood still. Birdsong quieted. Wind ceased rustling the leaves. The prince leaned forward, not daring to breathe. The dwarves behind him froze like statues of moss and time, and then her eyes fluttered. It began with the gentlest twitch of her lashes. Her lips, red as a rose, half-bloomed, parted for breath. A single gasp escaped her chest, like the first sound of spring after a long winter. Snow White blinked once, then again, as if trying to remember where the dream ended and the world began. Her fingers curled around the prince's hand. The dwarves let out a collective cry, not of shock, but of something greater. Joy. Relief. Wonder so deep, it felt holy. Snow White sat up slowly, eyes wide and searching. Her gaze found the prince still kneeling before her, and her expression softened into recognition. "You," she whispered. "You came back. I never meant to leave you," he said, voice hoarse. "And I'm sorry I waited so long." She touched her throat, then her lips, as if to feel that they were real. "I had a dream, or maybe it was sleep. I saw light, then nothing, and now you're here." The prince reached up and gently brushed her hair from her face. "It wasn't a dream, Snow White. It was a spell, another curse. But it's over now. You're safe." She looked around. The dwarves were wiping their eyes. The trees leaned inward, golden with late sunlight, as if bowing in reverence. Somewhere a bird sang the softest note, and the forest exhaled. That night, they did not sleep. They lit a great fire in the clearing. The dwarves brought out their finest food, simple things, but made with love, stewed roots, fresh bread, honey from a hidden hive. The prince shared tales of his travels and how he had searched the woods every season since their last meeting, drawn always toward the memory of her laughter in the garden. Snow White listened quietly, her hand still resting in his. When the flames burned low and the stars spilled overhead like scattered pearls, the prince turned to her. "I've never met anyone like you," he said. "You live like the light lives softly, without trying. You made a home of the forest. You made family of strangers. And though you were betrayed, you never became bitter. Snow White looked down. I tried to forget who I was. It felt easier to be no one. But you're not no one, he said. You're Snow White, and the world still needs your light. She turned to the dwarves. I never meant to become so much a part of your lives. I don't know how to leave. The eldest dwarf stepped forward. Child, he said gently, you never leave those who love you. Whether near or far, you're part of our story now. And so it was decided. The next morning, with tears and embraces, the dwarves watched as Snow White climbed onto the prince's horse. She promised to return often. She kissed each of them on the cheek. And when the forest path finally swallowed her from sight, they stood for a long while, staring into the trees that had once hidden her and now released her. The journey back to the kingdom was long, but gentle. Snow White rode with her arms wrapped around the prince's waist, her head resting lightly against his back. She asked about the lands they passed, their names, their legends, and he told her stories, half true and half dream. By the time they arrived at the gates of the castle, word of her return had already begun to spread, like fire caught on wind. But not all hearts rejoiced. Far above the throne room, in a tower, now choked with shadows and cold, the queen stood before her mirror one final time. She did not ask her usual question. She already knew the answer. Snow White was alive, the fairest, the beloved, and she once worshipped for her beauty was no longer needed. The mirror, sensing the shift, began to crack. A single line split down its center, and with it, the queen's composure. No, she whispered, voice hollow. I did everything right. I did everything I had to. The mirror did not answer. She turned from it and disappeared from history. Some say she fled. Others say she was swallowed by her own magic. But no one ever saw her again. When Snow White stepped into the palace halls once more, she was not the same girl who had left it. She was not simply beautiful. She was radiant with something deeper. Wisdom, kindness, resilience. The king, now older and grayer, fell to his knees when he saw her. My child, he sobbed. My precious daughter. She held him, not with anger, but with quiet grace. You didn't know, she said. You were hurting. And she knew how to hide. The prince stood beside them, offering no grand speeches, only presence. And that was enough. In the days that followed, the kingdom sang again. Bells rang in every tower. Flowers bloomed where none had before. And the girl who had once been left for dead became a queen, not of power, but of peace. She ruled with a hand open, not clenched. She built schools, planted gardens, opened doors, and beside her always stood the prince who had loved her not for her title, but for her truth. The kingdom had not known such joy in many years. From distant villages to bustling towns, news of Snow White's return spread like sunlight breaking through clouds. Children danced in the streets. Bakers crafted loaves shaped like apples and doves. Musicians tuned old instruments, long left silent. There was a quiet hum of something sacred in the air, not just celebration, but healing. And at the center of it all stood a young woman who had once been lost in the woods. Snow White walked through the palace gardens each morning, her fingers brushing the petals of wildflowers, her heart still catching on the strangeness of it all. The castle that had once been a place of shadows now felt open, bright, and full of laughter. Servants who had once pitied her now greeted her with sincere smiles. Courtiers bowed not to a title, but to a truth they had once overlooked. Kindness could never be hidden forever. The prince remained ever at her side, but never ahead of her. He listened when she spoke, smiled when she laughed, and looked at her as if the stars were spilling from her skin. In private, he would whisper the simplest things, how her eyes reminded him of the deep woods, how her voice had become his favorite sound, how grateful he was that fate had led him back to her. They sat often beneath the apple tree her mother had planted so many years ago, the same tree that had once dropped blossoms into Snow White's hair when she was a child. It was older now, as was she, but it still bloomed as if it remembered her. And so one morning, beneath its soft white petals, the prince knelt beside her. "Snow White," he said gently, "you were stolen from the world too early. But now you are here, whole wiser, stronger. I cannot imagine a kingdom, a morning, or a life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Snow White smiled. Not a smile of surprise, but of knowing. She had felt this question in his every glance, every act of quiet devotion. Her eyes filled with tears, not from uncertainty, but from the sheer beauty of it all. "Yes," she whispered, "I will." Preparations began immediately, though Snow White insisted the wedding be simple, filled with real joy, not royal spectacle. "Let it be in the garden," she said, "under the tree, where everything began." And so it was. On the day of the wedding, the skies were the color of soft cream, and the wind carried the scent of lilacs. The garden was adorned with ribbons, but not gold ones, only those dyed with herbs and flowers, the colors of earth and sky. Villagers mingled freely with nobles. The dwarves were seated in a place of honor, their eyes wide and their beards freshly combed. When Snow White appeared, she wore no crown, only a wreath of apple blossoms in her hair. Her gown was soft and simple, flowing like mist down a hillside. The prince wore forest green, a nod to the woods that had hidden and healed her. They met beneath the apple tree. The vows they spoke were not ancient lines written by scribes, but promises born from real days of fear and hope, silence and song. I vow to see you, even when the world forgets, he said, and I vow to love you, even when the story fades, she replied. The wind blew gently. Petals fell around them like blessings from the past. When they kissed, it was not the end of a fairy tale. It was the beginning of a life. Not perfect, not without sorrow, but one rooted in truth, like the tree above them. That evening, as the stars rose and the feast began, the dwarves stood to give their blessings. The eldest cleared his throat, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief far too small. There was a time, he said, when we thought we'd lost her forever. When her light went out, our home grew dim. But she came back to us stronger than ever. And now she carries that light into the world. The crowd cheered, and Snow White, overwhelmed with love, stepped forward and embraced each of her 7 friends, one by one. They had saved her, and she would never forget it. Later that night, when the music faded and the guests had drifted to their rooms, Snow White returned to the garden. Alone, now barefoot, she stepped beneath the tree once more. She touched its bark gently. "Mother," she whispered, "you wished for me here. You brought me into this world with snow and stars. And I hope I've made you proud." A single blossom fell into her palm. She closed her fingers around it and held it to her heart. From that night on, the kingdom flourished, not because of wealth or might, but because it had remembered something ancient and often forgotten, that grace is stronger than greed, that light outlives darkness, and that sometimes the softest voice leaves the deepest echo. And so, Snow White, winner, Queen of Kindness, lived not in legend, but in every blooming tree, every brave heart, and every quiet act of love that followed. Not far from the joy-soaked garden where love had triumphed beneath the apple tree, a quiet darkness still lingered in the high tower of the castle. Though the queen had vanished from courtly life, her chamber remained untouched, as if even the walls were afraid to disturb the remnants of her magic. The mirror was still there, cracked now, a jagged seam splitting it like a wound across the glass. No one had dared to approach it, not the maids, not the guards, not even the king who refused to climb those stairs again. But the mirror remembered. It had once served its mistress well, reflecting not light, but power. It had been her companion, her confessor, her judge. And now abandoned, it whispered in the dark to no one, the fairest. She has risen. The spell is broken, but magic like memory is not so easily buried. Snow White knew nothing of this. For her, each day was filled with warmth. She woke to sunlight on silk sheets. She strolled through gardens she had once only dreamed of reclaiming. She visited nearby villages, speaking kindly with the poor and the forgotten. And in all of it, the prince, her husband, now stood beside her, not as ruler, but as friend. Yet still, sometimes she would pause in a hallway and feel it, a chill like a thread of shadow woven into the air, something unfinished. One evening, as the moon poured silver into the castle's corridors, she found herself standing before a staircase she hadn't climbed in years. It spiraled upward like a question. The old tower. She didn't remember her feet moving. She only knew that something within her was calling her upward. When she reached the top, the door was half open. Dust floated through the air like old ghosts. And there, draped in torn velvet and moonlight, stood the mirror. She stepped inside. The room smelled of dried roses and forgotten spells. Her reflection in the glass wavered once, twice, then stilled. She spoke, not knowing why. Looking glass. On the wall, the mirror pulsed, then for the first time answered her, Snow White. It said, "Not my queen, not mistress, but her true name, spoken in a voice older than time. You are not here to ask, but to end." She stared at the glass. "What are you?" "I am the echo of envy," the mirror said. "The spell of a broken woman who once wished to be worshipped. I lived because she fed me. Her vanity gave me voice." "Then why do you still speak, Snow White?" asked quietly. The mirror flickered. "Because a final truth has not been faced." Snow White stepped closer. "Show me." The mirror's surface rippled like water, then cleared. She saw the queen not as she was remembered, but as she once was. A young girl, shivering in a cold stone room, clutching a comb of her mother's, and weeping. She saw her growing neglected, striving for beauty, because it was the only thing that had ever earned her love. She saw her become cruel, not from birth, but from pain. Snow White pressed a hand to her heart. She did not forgive the queen's actions, but she understood their roots. "Let her rest," she whispered. "Let the story end." With those words, the mirror cracked fully, its final line splitting it in two. The glass fell inward, shattering not loudly, but like rain, and with it, the last spell faded from the air. Down in the village, an old tree that had not bloomed in decades suddenly bore fruit. A child who had not spoken in years laughed aloud. A woman in the market shed tears and did not know why. the land remembered. Magic had shifted back in the tower. Snow White stood amid the broken pieces of something ancient and sorrowful. She knelt, gathered the largest shard, and saw her reflection one last time, not as a girl in hiding, not as a princess, but as herself, whole. Later, she and the prince quietly cleared the chamber. No servants were summoned. No records were written. They wrapped the pieces of the mirror in cloth and buried them beneath the roots of the apple tree. Let beauty return to the soil, Snow White thought. Let truth take root again. And so the mirror was gone. The queen whose name history did not keep was gone, and in their place, peace, true peace, the kind that does not shine like gold, but grows like moss over stone, soft, enduring, real. Snow White ruled not through command, but care. She walked among her people with bare feet and listening ears. The dwarves visited, often bringing wildflowers and riddles. Children named their daughters after her. Artists painted her not on thrones, but in gardens. She never forgot the forest. She never forgot the dark, but neither did she let them rule her. And every spring, as the apple tree began to bloom, she would return to it alone and thank the mother who once whispered a wish into the snow, a wish that had become a life. Snow White didn't just survive the curse, she outgrew it. She didn't return to take revenge. She returned to remember who she truly was. From a forest of betrayal to a throne of compassion, not because of magic, not because of fate, but because she chose light again and again, no matter how dark the path. Her story isn't about happily ever after. It's about always rising, always loving, always remembering who you were, even when the world forgets.